Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 305 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. The last year and a half has been difficult for many of us. Not only has the pandemic required us to quarantine and social distance, it has also required us to adjust the way we handle and think about death. Death is one of the few universals in life. Everyone who is born will die. So how do the living make peace with death? Erik Seeman is a professor of history at the University at Buffalo. He's an award-winning historian who has written 3 books on death practices in early America, including his most recent book, Speaking with the Dead in Early America. Now, while different cultures make peace with death in different ways, Erik joins us to investigate how white American Protestants made their peace with death during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Now, during our investigation, Erik reveals early American ideas about death, information about the English Reformation, and how Anglo-American Protestants came to believe that relationships with the dead were possible, and the ways in which some Anglo-American Protestants forged relationships with the dead. But first, a programming note. Some years ago, the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team and I started creating special episodes to commemorate the 4th of July. This year is no exception. We have a great episode in the works for you, which will explore the history, memory, and story of King George III's Bowling Green statue in New York City. Now, as the 4th of July falls on a Sunday this year, we've decided to move up our release date from July 6 to July 2. This way, you have the episode to enjoy over the 4th of July holiday. So our next episode will release on Friday, July 2nd, and then we'll resume our regular release schedule on Tuesday, July 20. Okay, are you ready to explore early American ideas about death and some of their death practices? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a professor of history at the University at Buffalo. His expertise is in the history of colonial North America, early American religion, and death practices. He's written 4 books, including Death in the New World, Cross-Cultural Encounters, 1492 to 1800, and, most recently, Speaking with the Dead in Early America, which won the Lawrence W. Levine Award for the best book in American cultural history from the Organization of American Historians in 2020. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Erik Seeman.
Thanks, Liz. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Me too. And I think we should cut to the chase here and start with the title of your book. You titled your book, Speaking with the Dead in Early America. And at least for me, when I read that title, I had images of seances and ghosts in my head. So I'm wondering, Erik, what do you mean by the phrase, Speaking with the Dead in Early America? And what kind of imagery does that phrase evoke for you?
That's a good question, Liz. I meant it to be a little provocative, actually. I'm glad it makes you think of seances and ghosts. Some of what I'm talking about in the book involves the literal speaking with the dead, vocalizations where the person is speaking out loud or imagining to hear voices. But those kinds of literal speaking with the dead moments are not the complete story in the book. What I'm really talking about more broadly in the book are continuing relationships with the dead. So people imagine that they continue to have a relationship with their deceased loved ones. That literal speaking, that literal vocalizing, that occurs when ghosts appear. That occurs after the period of my book when I'm talking about when spiritualism starts after 1848. But they're not the only way people maintained relationships with the dead. Some of those relationships, some of those conversations were more imagined. They would think about their deceased loved one. One of the historians, actually a scholar of religion, that I rely on in the book is the great religious studies scholar Robert Orsi, who's written that religion is a network of relationships between heaven and earth. And that's the perspective that I'm using, those connections between heaven and earth, sometimes embodied in speaking, and sometimes more through this imagined kind of conversation or communion with the dead.
You mentioned that speaking with the dead should be taken quite literally, that people in early America were having conversations and were speaking with the dead. And I wonder if you could help us form the right picture in our minds about this. Was this a case where someone died suddenly and then the living are speaking to the body of the deceased? Or are they speaking to the spirit or imagined memory of the deceased?
So sometimes, like I said, it occurs quite literally when a person imagines that a ghost appears. We think of ghosts as kind of anonymous haunting spirits. Like if you think of a haunted house today, you'll think of a kind of anonymous spirit. But really, more ghost encounters in the early modern world were the returned dead who were loved ones, people you knew, or neighbors, or things like that. So in those cases, the dead, the ghost would say words. Sometimes the living person would respond to the ghost. And so in that way, there would be a conversation. But more of the conversation between the living and the dead occurs without actually opening one's mouth and speaking words. Sometimes that happens through a process that I call praying to the dead. And that's something that Protestants aren't really thought to be doing in the period that we're talking about. But when a woman in particular, men did this sometimes, but it was more women, and it was over the course of the 300 years covered in my book, it's more common in the 19th century than in the earlier periods. Women would write prayers to their deceased loved ones in their diaries. So in that kind of sense, a person is imagining a relationship with the deceased, they're writing, and they're addressing the person. So here's one of my favorite examples. Sally Hersey was a Congregational woman who lived in central Massachusetts in the first part of the 19th century. She kept a 200-page spiritual journal. It's an incredible document. It's sitting right there in the Massachusetts Historical Society, and as far as I can tell, no historian has ever used it. It's never been quoted anywhere. And what happened was her son died in 1826. He had left home, left Massachusetts to go to North Carolina, and she hadn't seen him in 7 years, learns that he's died. And what happens is after that, she continues this relationship with him by writing what are essentially prayers to him in heaven, saying, Austin, I miss you. I think of your face. I want you to be happy. I'm sorry I wasn't there at your death. So she's communicating with him using her diary as the medium for crafting these prayers to the dead.
There is so much to talk about here. And I promise you, we are going to come back to ghosts and speaking with the dead. But first, Erik, you mentioned that there was something called the spiritualism movement, and that you began researching your book, Speaking with the Dead, to uncover the prehistory of this mid-19th century movement. Could you tell us a bit about spiritualism and the movement and about its early origins?
Sure. So your listeners may have heard of the Fox sisters who lived in Hydesville, New York, outside of Rochester. And starting in 1848, they began to hear rappings in their house, knockings, what later became to be called the Rochester rappings. So that was 1848, and these girls claimed that these knockings were caused by a ghost, and moreover, that they could understand what that ghost was trying to tell them by decoding the knocks. So they began to tell people about this in their neighborhood. Eventually, they put on a demonstration of their abilities to speak with this ghost in Rochester. It was 1849. Then in 1850, they put on a demonstration in New York City. And it was well attended, and people just went wild for this. These girls could communicate with this ghost, understand the knockings of this ghost. And that inspired this movement that would eventually be called spiritualism. There were other mediums who stepped forward and said that they too could communicate with ghosts or with the dead in heaven. And they would hold seances. That was a new term from the French word for a sitting, where people would sit around a table and the medium would communicate with the dead. So in the 1850s, spiritualism exploded in popularity. It went from 0 adherents at the start of the decade to hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions, at least according to the spiritualists, by the end of the decade. So the question that I always had, and actually this came from my students in a class that I teach called Death in America, a big lecture class, they would always wonder, how did this get so popular so fast? And I wondered the same thing. So that was really the origin of the book, was me looking for the roots of this. How could it have gotten so popular so quickly?
And what did you find in your research?
So I started with the decades immediately before 1848, figuring that was the best way to look, the best place to look. And that's in fact where other historians have looked. Other historians have identified other groups right before spiritualism in the 1820s and 30s and 40s who spoke with the dead. The Shakers are probably the best known. Swedenborgians as well were also pointed to. Mesmerists claimed some degree of being able to communicate with the dead. And I wasn't satisfied with those answers because those groups are all so small. There were a few thousand Shakers and really only a few hundred Swedenborgians. It just didn't seem plausible as the starting point for a movement that in the 1850s would, again, blossom into the hundreds of thousands or maybe millions. So I started to look more broadly for interest in communicating with the dead. And that's where I started finding it in all sorts of sources. When I broadened my definition of what communication with the dead was about, I started to find it in parlor songs, the songs that people would sing around a piano or just together in a parlor in the 1830s and 1840s, funeral hymns, sentimental poetry. Those were the 19th century sources I was examining. So I started to look further back in the 18th century and found evidence of interest in communication with the dead in newspapers and magazines, stories about ghosts that were reported in newspapers. Back to the 17th century, I went and found examples in Salem witchcraft trials, Puritan elegies, gravestones, all sorts of places, it turned out, showed interest in maintaining relationships with the dead.
I'm glad you brought up historical sources because I have a question about the sources you used. But first, to stay with spiritualism, Adam has a question about the practice of spiritualism. So Adam would like to know how much the practice of spiritualism was accepted by 19th century Americans as compared with the number of early Americans who doubted that one could really speak with the dead.
That's a great question. There was a real strong split of opinion on this. There were definitely opposers, people who didn't believe it at all. There's a great quote from the diary of George Templeton Strong. He was a lawyer in New York City, and he wrote, I'll paraphrase, he said, "Who would have thought that in the enlightened 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Americans would believe that they could speak with the ghosts of their grandparents?" So he was pretty dismissive. This idea that, we're an enlightened country, it's an enlightened era, and yet people are talking about speaking with the dead. That's crazy, is what he said. Your listeners may know that Harry Houdini was a famous debunker of spiritualism in the 1920s. And there were debunkers in the 19th century as well, earlier than Houdini. And they would go to seances deliberately to try to trip people up or find the tricks that they were using to have voices emanate from a corner of the room. So there were definitely people who did not believe this. But as I said, there were hundreds of thousands and maybe millions of sincere believers, people who absolutely thought this was the truth and gained a great deal of comfort from it.
I guess it would be hard to try and get exact numbers on this, as I doubt there were any polls at the time that asked people, hey, do you speak with the dead? Do you believe that you can speak with the dead?
That, and also that spiritualism was a famously decentralized movement. They tried for decades to create a national organization in the second part of the 19th century and had real trouble doing so because there wasn't a kind of central body declaring what was orthodox, what was not, what are the accepted tenets. It was really anyone, mostly women, who wanted to hang up a shingle and say, I can communicate with the dead. I'll do a reading for $3. They could do that, or do a lecture in front of an audience. There was no central body saying that, you're not licensed to do that. So anyways, that makes keeping track of the numbers extremely hard.
Now, I wonder if we could return to historical sources, because we are curious to know what kinds of historical sources that are available to tell us how early Americans understood death and interpreted basically their living relationships with those who had died. So, Erik, you mentioned that you used newspapers, magazines, trial records, diaries, and even gravestones. It really sounds like there are a lot of different historical sources that one could use to tell us about early Americans' understandings about death.
Yeah, and that was really central to my methodology. I mean, really from the start of my career, I've been a social historian, someone who's interested in the beliefs and practices of non-elites, of what are sometimes, I think, sort of poorly called ordinary people. I'll call them non-elites. And so if you're going to understand those people, you have to go beyond the kind of typical, ministerial sermons, theological treatises, things like that. So I mentioned a lot of those sources that you described. Also a lot of material culture in the book. Gravestones, mourning embroidery, portraiture, oil portraiture of the deceased. Sources like those are left by people who sometimes leave no other written sources. These are people for whom we have, notations in tax records, things like that, but nothing else that they've written, no diaries or letters. And so if we look at the gravestone that their family left for them, or the mourning embroidery that a 17-year-old girl stitched when she was at a female academy, we can get insight into her ideas in a way that we can't from any other kinds of sources.
So knowing that you used all sorts of historical sources, both written and material sources, was there a historical source in particular that you found the most revealing or, even surprisingly revealing about early Americans' ideas about death and their ability to speak with and to have a relationship with those who had died?
I would have to say the diaries, especially the late 18th century, early 19th century women's spiritual diaries. I love diaries. It feels a little voyeuristic to be reading someone's very personal thoughts from, 2 or 3 centuries ago. It feels like a powerful window into their lives. I have to be careful not to be seduced by these sources into thinking that they are transparent or unmediated sources of a person's inner life, because, whereas today, most people think of diaries as completely private sources with a lock and you put it under your mattress or whatever. In this period, many people kept diaries understanding that their children would read them after they died. People might read them. So they're not quite as unmediated as sometimes I might get carried away into thinking they are. But still, they're very revealing. Let me give you one example. One of my favorite diaries. It's a woman named Adelia Lamb from Berlin in central Connecticut. That's not Berlin, it's Berlin. And she lived in Berlin in the first half of the 19th century. And her spiritual diary is at the Connecticut Historical Society. Actually, someone has done us the favor of creating a typescript of it, so you don't even have to read her handwriting. Someone in I think it was the 1930s, typed it up. And yet, no one's ever used it. It's a fantastic source. And what was most revealing in her diary was just how powerful a place graveyards were for her. She went to graveyards to commune with the dead. There was a little cemetery in her town called the Beckley Cemetery, or the Beckley Quarter Cemetery. And her maiden name was Beckley. She was Adelia Beckley Lamb. By the time that she was visiting that cemetery, there were about 100 Beckleys buried there. So she said, I would go there to commune with my family. Her father was there, 2 of her brothers, and most powerfully for her, her mother. She would sit by her mother's grave, think about her spirit hovering around her, and communicate with her mother.
Now, in his book, Speaking with the Dead in Early America, Erik notes that in order for us to understand how colonial British Americans, and more specifically the Puritans, made sense of life after death, that we first need to really understand pre-Reformation Catholicism and how the English Reformation aimed to change Catholic beliefs. Erik, would you provide us with an overview of this important religious history?
I think I can make this religious history not so boring as your listeners might fear. I mean, this is actually a pretty interesting story. So, an incredibly important part of late medieval Catholicism was purgatory, as you note. And most people will know that that's kind of the middle place between heaven and hell. Basically, in late medieval Catholicism, the vast majority of souls went first to purgatory. They didn't go to heaven or hell. Heaven was only for souls of really true saints. Hell was for the complete, absolute evil sinners. Most souls went to purgatory. The key aspect of understanding purgatory and its importance for these people was that the living had a role. So people went to purgatory and would stay there for an indeterminate period of time, with their sins being purged away by fire. And the living could shorten the amount of time that souls spent in purgatory by praying for those souls, by paying to have masses performed in the name of those souls. So what purgatory did was it institutionalized, in effect, a relationship between the living and the dead. As one historian famously put it, in late medieval and early modern Catholic Europe, the dead were pretty much like an age group in society. So you had children, you had adults, you had the elderly, and you had the dead. They were part of society. People thought about them frequently as they prayed for them. They thought about them when they paid for masses, and they actually expected the dead in purgatory to return the favor by praying for them. So it was a two-way relationship between the living and the dead. Now that changed with the Protestant Reformation, which is conventionally dated to 1517, when Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses. After the Protestant Reformation, Protestants argued that purgatory was made up. It was something that Catholics had made up. There's no evidence, they said, of it in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Martin Luther actually kind of hung on to his belief in purgatory for a little while, but by the 1530s, he too was convinced that there was no such thing as purgatory. And here's the important part, that souls went directly either to heaven or to hell, but not this in-between place, and that the living couldn't influence where that soul went. So suddenly, there's supposed to be a bright line between the living and the dead. Unlike this medieval Catholic continuing relationship, for Protestants, there was supposed to be no connection between the living and the dead. Now that's in theory, and what the book goes on to explain was how in practice it was much blurrier than that.
So if the Protestant Reformation really informed how English Protestants thought about death and purgatory, how did so many early Americans come to the belief that the dead were alive in such a way that the living could communicate with them?
That's a really key question that the book seeks to answer. So as I said, according to the theory of Protestantism, there's supposed to be this bright line between the living and the dead. But in practice, it never really played out that way. And that was partly a story of lay people wanting to communicate with the dead, but it was also a story of ministers, Protestant ministers as well, interested in the appearance of ghosts and other supernatural phenomena. So even though in theory it was a nice simple declaration that humans can have no influence on the dead, and when the dead go to heaven, they're not interested in us anymore because they're just in perfect bliss up there. Why would they care about what's going on with us? In reality, lay people and ministers alike were much more interested in those connections, and ministers were pushed by their parishioners to explain. Parishioners would ask questions like, will I reunite with my loved ones in heaven? So they had to come up with answers for that. And sometimes their answers would focus on this continued connection between the living and the dead, that the dead are looking down, watching over us. They care about what's happening. So it's really a kind of combination of lay people and ministers over the course of the 16th and 17th century who are just very interested in what those possibilities for relationships are.
Now, after the Reformation, there was the Enlightenment. And it does seem like, for the most part, early Americans embraced the ideas of the Enlightenment and scientific thought. So Ethan wonders, in what ways the Enlightenment may have informed or conflicted with the ideas that we've just been talking about, specifically the idea that people in early America could speak with the dead.
Definitely for some people, Enlightenment ideas would have conflicted with some aspects of this belief in continuing relationships with the dead. So one way that that manifests itself is through changing ideas about ghosts. So in the 17th century, pretty much everyone in Anglo-American society believed in ghosts, believed that the dead returned. But because of the influence of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, elites increasingly viewed ghosts not so much that they were impossible. Most elites would have said that God still maintained the power to allow the souls of the dead to return to earth. But they came to think of it as just much more unlikely. So this kind of Enlightenment skepticism began to change some people's ideas about the frequency, really, of ghosts returning to earth. But there's another important idea about the Enlightenment that I talk about in the book, that part of the Enlightenment was not so much about specific ideas that people could kind of check off on a checklist, but about new tools or new media for exchanging ideas. So things like lending libraries or magazines or discussion circles and salons. All of those are important parts of the Enlightenment, and those new tools or new media don't necessarily point toward any particular belief. So while magazines often contained ideas that were inimical to ghost belief and belief in continuing relations with the dead, they could just as easily contain ideas that promoted those ideas as well. So the media of Enlightenment exchange and that kind of republic of letters and all that, the media are neutral and allow for the expression of some of these ideas that sometimes had been even harder to express before the Enlightenment. Now with the expansion of print, you get things like vision narratives being published, people saying that they went to heaven and saw what heaven was like, and that can be published and spread around to other people.
As we've discussed in prior episodes of this podcast, the Enlightenment was a transatlantic movement of ideas, and Europeans and British Americans frequently wrote back and forth to each other to share different publications and to discuss and share different ideas about daily life and theoretical concepts. So, Erik, were ideas about speaking with the dead also transatlantic in nature? Because Jim specifically wonders to what extent Europeans and those living in the United Kingdom and Great Britain practice spiritualism, which, as we discussed earlier, is the practice of communicating with the dead.
That's another good question from a listener. In fact, the first working title of the book was Speaking with the Dead in England and America, 1500 to 1850 or something like that. And the first chapter was on early modern England. After I sent it to the press and they sent it out to an outside evaluator, that outside evaluator convinced me that it was better to think of the book really focus on America. And so the title now reflects that. But there's still a lot of transatlantic components to the book, from the start of the book in the English Reformation in the 1530s through the relationships between Cotton Mather and the American ghost hunters with their Restoration England colleagues. They sent letters back and forth about what ghosts were made of, how you can explain their return, all the way through to the 19th century, where Manchester, England, surprisingly for me at least, turned out to be a real important center of connection between England and the United States. There was a lot of spiritual activity In Manchester in the 18th century, it was where the Shakers were formed. In the 19th century, it was where Mormon missionaries went from the United States and gathered a lot of followers there. So there were plenty of transatlantic connections. And then that just gets further embodied in spiritualism in the 1850s, which, as I said earlier, absolutely was very popular in England and in continental Europe as well.
Now, before we shift gears a bit and talk about ghosts, which I guess is not really shifting gears so much because ghosts keep popping up in our conversation. But before we talk about ghosts, we should talk about our episode sponsor. One of the few universals in life is death. And over the last 18 months, we've been dealing with a lot of loss and death. And this is in addition to all the depression, stress, and anxiety that has been wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic. If you're experiencing grief, depression, stress and anxiety, family conflicts, or any other symptoms that are impacting your mental health, you should check out BetterHelp. BetterHelp is professional counseling done securely online, which makes speaking with a therapist and taking control of your mental health very convenient. You can message your counselor anytime, and anything you share with your counselor is confidential. Now, how BetterHelp works is that the service matches you with your own licensed professional therapist, who you meet with in a safe and private online environment. And because the service is offered online instead of in a physical office, you receive the benefit of professional counseling at a more affordable price than traditional offline counseling. Plus, it's way more convenient too. No more office visits, which means you also have the advantage of finding a counselor who is really the right match for you, even if they live 4 states away from where you live. So start living a happier life today. As a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting BetterHelp.com/Ben Franklin. Join over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health. Again, visit BetterHelp, HELP.com/Ben Franklin. Erik, ghosts are something that keep popping up in our conversation. So would you tell us how early Americans imagined and understood ghosts and what kinds of ghost stories they may have shared with one another?
I argue that the main interest in ghosts is about the specific returned dead. So again, there are things like poltergeists, which are kind of spirits that inhabit a house and can kind of create noises and things like that. But people were mostly interested in the returned dead, specific individuals, and the dead returned because they had a message. They had unfinished business. Something happened. They were buried poorly, or they needed to reveal something to the living. And so they would come back to let that information be known. Sometimes it's really kind of humble sorts of things. So in one collection of scientific ghost stories collected by the scientific ghost hunter in England in the late 17th century, Joseph Glanville, one man comes back to tell his friend that he's upset because he hasn't been keeping his sword sharp enough. So the dead guy had willed his sword to the living man, and the dead man returns to tell him, you better, keep that oiled and sharp for me. More commonly, people would have an interaction with a loved one. So one woman in that same collection of scientific ghost stories, one woman was really upset because she hadn't seen her father for some months before he died. And then he died and she'd never see him again. Well, a few months later, he returns by her bedside. They talk. She's happy. She never has to worry again. Now, those are all 17th century stories. So when we talk about ghost belief in early America, it's really important to specify what century we're talking about. So in the 17th century, like I said earlier, pretty much everyone believes in ghosts. Ministers, lay people, elites, ordinary people, uneducated people. Over the course of the 18th century, as I said before, skepticism increases among elites. By the 19th century, ghosts really aren't the most important way that people conceptualize their relations with the dead. By the 19th century, that's the beginning of what I term in the book the cult of the dead, which is a term that I use to describe a whole range of beliefs that emerged toward the end of the 18th century the beginning of the 19th century, in which people believe that they can have continuing relationships with the dead. They believe that souls can return as guardian angels, like Adelia Lamb. They believe that they can go to graveyards and commune with the spirits of their loved ones. So that cult of the dead becomes more important by the 19th century than kind of traditional ghost belief.
You know, we've talked a lot about ghosts and speaking with the dead. And thus far, our conversation really has focused on the death rituals of white Protestant Americans. And since you've also written another book called Death in the New World, Cross-Cultural Encounters, 1492 to 1800, I wonder if we could zoom out for a few moments and talk about ghosts and ideas about speaking with the dead from within the more vast context of early America. So how did Native American cultures and traditions and African cultures and traditions think about death and speaking with the dead?
That's such an important question, Liz. I'm glad you asked it. So absolutely. In this period, everyone believes that communication with the dead is possible. Africans, American Indians, people elsewhere. It's essentially, in this time period, a universal aspect of religion. Looking forward to a later period, there's a pair of fantastic books that I would recommend to anybody by the anthropologist Piers Vitebsky, Dialogues with the Dead and Living with the Dead, about the Sora people, an indigenous group in India, and their traditions of communication with the dead and how central that is really to their society. So it's absolutely important for the American Indians who are in North America before Europeans arrive. And it's an important part of the religious practice of Africans who are forcibly brought over as part of the slave trade. The reason why I decided to focus on white Protestant Americans in this book is that it's the more surprising story, really, that people understand that Africans in this period had indigenous traditions of ancestor communication. I talk about that in Death in the New World. People understand that American Indians had very important connections with their ancestors and relations with the bones of the dead. And that's really understood, and anthropologists have talked about that for a long time. But really, for the last couple of centuries, scholars have talked about Protestantism as if it's something different, as if it's a series of beliefs that one kind of checks off belief in, and that those beliefs are what are articulated by, the founding theologians of the religion. And it includes this alleged break between the living and the dead, this lack of relationship between the living and the dead. So whereas you're absolutely right that in vast early America, speaking with the dead is completely widespread, I wanted to focus on the Anglo-American Protestants in the northern United States for whom that's been less well understood, or in fact, not at all understood.
So earlier we were talking about how there's a lot of material culture in your book, and that early Americans spoke with the dead literally by speaking to them, but that there's also a lot of material culture, meaning objects, that spoke to the dead. Would you tell us more about the material culture of death?
Absolutely. That was one of my favorite parts of doing research for this book, because as I said, I was trying to find the voices of people who didn't leave a lot of sources, and so I turned to material culture. I've got a whole chapter on gravestones, because starting in 1750 or so, a lot of epitaphs represented the dead as speaking or being spoken to. Now again, this is an imaginative form of communication with the dead. So an epitaph might say something like this: "Dear reader, as you pass by, think about me, you'll be like me soon." Or it might be directed more specifically to a loved one. So, "Dear husband, I'm gone, but you will be with me soon," right? So no one thinks that that epitaph is, like a seance, like that a medium has brought those words and said, "Oh, I heard this, and so I'm going to carve it on the gravestone." It's not that. It's understood to be imaginative, but it's a representation of that desire for a continuing connection with the dead. So the woman who on her gravestone says, "Dear husband, you will be with me soon," it represents her desire that she wants to continue to see him in heaven, and it represents his desire. He's the one who would have had that carved on her stone. So it shows how both the living and the dead, had that relationship. So another form of material culture that I became very interested in was hair. So people would share locks of hair from the dead. So I've got a great quote from a diary where an old woman dies and her granddaughter writes a letter to her cousins and says, it was quite a scene. We cut dear Granny almost bald. So many people wanted a lock of her hair. So after she died, people could keep a lock of her hair, and that physical manifestation of her body would symbolize their continued connection with her.
Erik, why do you think we need to study early American ideas about relationships with the dead and speaking with the dead? What do you think these ideas can add to our knowledge about early America?
I think there are a couple of main takeaways. First of all, the version of Protestantism that emerges from my book is very different than the version of Protestantism that we often encounter in studying early America. So it's a version of Protestantism that includes the dead as a central part of it, and it includes lay people as central shapers of the religion. So one of the things that surprised me over the course of the book was how it essentially became a women's history, or certainly as the chapters went on. And by the time I got to the last two chapters that focus on the cult of the dead in the 19th century, women became more and more important, more and more central in this story. And there are plenty of books that talk about women and religion, but the idea of women actually shaping Protestant belief, that's not talked about quite as much. And because women were so interested in maintaining these relationships with the dead, they worked at it. It took work. Sometimes they would embroider something that would memorialize the deceased. They would write out these prayers in their journals. They shaped what Protestantism became. And so instead of by understanding Protestantism simply by reading what ministers wrote and reading these spiritual journals by women, I think I've shown that women helped to shape it, shape the very outcome of what that religion was over the course of these centuries.
Before we jump into the time warp, I wanted to ask you, as historians, we tend to look at the present and think about patterns or occurrences that we see that are similar to occurrences that we know happened in the past. And over the last year and a half, we've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and a lot of death. So I'm curious, Erik, are any of the evolving death practices that we've had to come up with and endure in our present, people dying alone or having to comfort and talk to them only on iPads, not having the ability to gather for a funeral? Is there anything about these adaptations that we've made today that have roots or origins in the death practices of the early American past?
I think definitely, Liz, because, historians are really uncomfortable with universals. And as a historian, I'm generally uncomfortable with universals. But if there's something that's nearly universal, it's that the living miss the dead, that we miss our deceased loved ones. And that's true across societies, across time. So the practices that I'm talking about in my book emerge because people miss their deceased loved ones. And they work to fill that hole in their lives with these various practices, whether it's creating a mourning embroidery or writing a diary entry or going to a graveyard like Adelia Lamb to talk with her deceased mother. And so today, people want those same connections. And that's why people get so upset when they can't be there at the end, when there's an inability to be at a funeral, like during March and April, during the strictest aspect of the lockdown. That was some of the most heartbreaking stories, were people unable to be with a loved one as they were dying or unable to have a funeral for that person. So I think the connection is that desire to be with the dying, to maintain a connection with the dead, and the rupture of not having any funeral practices, not having that tradition, a ritual to fall back on. That was why it was so painful for people.
Now for the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, Erik, what might have happened if the English Reformation had never happened? How might early Americans have viewed their living relationship with the dead differently? And would the spiritualism movement have still come about during the 19th century?
Wow, that's a tough one. Let's think about England had it remained Catholic. I mean, the most obvious thing is that purgatory would have continued. So people would have continued that kind of relationship between the living and the dead, where they were able to pray for the dead and they were able to pay for masses for the dead to help their souls get out of purgatory and to have the dead in purgatory pray for them. So that would have satisfied a lot of those desires for continuing relationships. So perhaps some of the other practices that emerged, it might not have been quite so urgent for them to emerge if purgatory had existed. Now, in terms of spiritualism, would spiritualism have arisen had England and, let's say, the United States continued to be Catholic? I think it could well have. Spiritualism was very much a product of its time, and it was influenced as much by science and technology, as we usually think about those concepts, as it was by religion. So people were very interested in trying to explain how communication could occur between heaven and earth. And there were a lot of, especially male sort of, one historian calls them harmonialists, using the terms of Andrew Jackson Davis, a clairvoyant from the 1840s. They were interested in kind of explaining the science behind communication between the spheres. And this is what mesmerists were interested in. And spiritualists often used scientific terms to describe how the living and dead could communicate. So they talked about the spiritual telegraph. That was like the very common metaphor they used. So the actual electronic telegraph had been recently invented. And they said that those kinds of forces like electricity, invisible things, were what bound this realm with the afterlife. So I think that spiritualism could well have emerged even in an entirely Catholic context.
So, Erik, do you have a new project in the works? Is there a new aspect of death practices in early America that you're researching now?
I do. I was trying to move a little bit away from looking at death practices quite so specifically after my 3 most recent books put that at the forefront. And I've wound up doing a topic that actually still does include a lot of death. So I guess I just can't get away from it. I'm writing a book about smallpox. And I started this before COVID. So the summer before COVID, I started a book on Boston's 1721 smallpox epidemic. And the thing that's always frustrated me about that, I don't know if you or your listeners know this, but that's the epidemic when inoculation was first implemented. So this epidemic has been written about a lot because it was the first use of inoculation in the Western world, I should say. It had been used in the Middle East and China and Africa before that, but never before in Europe or among Anglo-Americans. So historians have written about Boston's 1721 smallpox epidemic a lot, but they always focus on the same 3 characters. It's Cotton Mather, who was a proponent of inoculation. It's Zabdiel Boylston, who was the physician who was doing the inoculations, and William Douglas, the physician who was most opposed to inoculation. So it's told as a story in the history of science, and it's very much an elite story. And I just wondered, what about the 10,000 other people who lived in Boston? How did they experience this epidemic? My working title is Boston's Pox of 1721, A People's History. That's kind of the perspective I'm taking. So I started it back in the summer of 2019, and then COVID hit. And it was suddenly awfully relevant. I kind of prefer my history research to be a bit of an escape from, the travails of modern life. And suddenly I was reading about inoculation and epidemic and those same issues that we've been dealing with since February, March. So that's what I'm working on now. It's actually really hard to do a people's history if you can't get into the archives. So I'm kind of stuck looking at the same newspaper and other kinds of sources that other historians have looked at. But soon I'll get into those great social history sources that will allow me to understand how ordinary people experienced the epidemic.
Now, if we have questions about death practices in early America, how can we get in contact you? Where's the best place?
I would say just go to my history department webpage at the University at Buffalo. I'm not a big social media person, so I don't have a Facebook or Twitter account. So people could just go to my webpage and find my email address there and get in touch with me.
Erik Seeman, thank you so much for joining us and for helping us to explore early American death practices.
Thanks, Liz. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
The great diversity in humanity means that there are few universals across all people. But death is one of those few universals. As Benjamin Franklin once said, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. So, how did people in early America understand and deal with death? As Erik Seeman related, nearly all early American cultures, Native American, African, and those of European descent, handled death in part by forging relationships with the dead. For white Anglo-American Protestants, relationships with the dead took the form of literal conversations. People might speak to their deceased loved ones by talking to their spirit or memory out loud, by imagining or seeing ghosts and having a conversation with them, or by having imagined conversations with the dead on gravestones, in prayers, or through mourning embroidery. Now, what may seem surprising about all of this, and what was certainly surprising for Erik, is just how much white women shaped these death practices and in turn shaped American Protestant beliefs and understandings about death. Now, the last year and a half has been among the most difficult that many of us will ever endure over the course of our lifetimes. As we deal with the loss of our loved ones, whether they died of COVID, from natural causes, or other diseases, it may be helpful for us to know that death has always been hard for the living. Throughout history, the living have always missed the dead, and as such, the living have often looked for ways to stay connected with those they have loved. You'll find more information about Erik, his book, Speaking with the Dead in Early America, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/305. This episode was sponsored by BetterHelp. Start living a happier life today. As a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting betterhelp.com/benfranklin. Join over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health. Again, that's BetterHelp, HELP.com/benfranklin. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, I hope you will accept my sincere condolences if you've lost a loved one during this pandemic. I know from experience that death is hard, but it was particularly hard when we couldn't really be with our loved ones or gather for funerals. I'm really sorry for your loss. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute